Good morning, everyone. Let's start the session. First, we have this plenary presentation by Professor Roger Pielke Jr. Let me introduce him first. Professor Roger Pielke Jr. is an academic at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he teaches and writes on a diverse range of policy and governance issues related to science, technology, environment, innovation, and sports. Roger is a professor in the Environmental Studies program and has authored many books that includes the famous book, The Honest Broker, Making Sense of Science in Policy and Politics, published by Cambridge University Press. He has a long list of accomplishments that I won't read out due to time constraints. Currently, he is focusing his research on 16-country evaluation of science advice in the COVID-19 pandemic, the details of which I am sure he will share during his presentation. So without further ado, let me give the microphone to Roger, who has already joined online. Roger, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thanks for the opportunity to share some of the work that I and many colleagues have done over the last few years on science advice in the COVID-19 pandemic. What I'm going to do is I have a presentation I'll go through, and it won't take up all the time, of course, and hopefully we'll have a chance to have some conversation afterwards. So I'm going to jump right into it. All right, so what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about our ESCAPE project. It's the acronym is Evaluation of Science Advice in a Pandemic Emergency. And then I think it's really important when we talk about science and science advice to be very clear on the concepts and terminology. Too often, the notion of science advice is what we might call an inkblot test. That people see in it what they want to see. I'll talk about some of the findings from our work and then some recommendations that follow. The ESCAPE project is really an effort by a lot of people who put in a lot of time around the world to try to develop lessons at the country and sub-national levels for the role of science in a very important, highly politicized event. The pandemic is notable not least because of all of its impact, but also because all of us all around the world were experiencing it. And it really provides a laboratory for taking a look at how science advice works, and unfortunately how science advice often does not work. We have in the project about 20 case studies, and so far I'll show about a dozen have been published or are very close to being published, and in many regions around the world. And due to the pandemic, some of the case studies, such as India, had to drop out. But it does provide a very rich basis for discussions of science advice. This is the obligatory slide with some of the publications we have. We have a special issue of the journal Humanities and Social Science Communications, which you can look up. It's a special issue, and I can send you the link. And there's a few more case studies still in the work. But a lot of products have come out of this, and what I'd like to do is talk to you more generally about some of the shared findings that have come out of this project. All right, some basic definitions, and I introduce definitions, and I know entire graduate courses are taught on these words, but just so you know what I mean when I use these words. So for science, that's simply the systematic pursuit of knowledge. It includes the social sciences, the humanities, maybe intelligence gathering. It's a very broad concept. An expert is someone who has experience, skill, or knowledge acquired by training, study, or practice. I view expertise to be a much broader concept, and I'll talk a bit about this than is science. Policy is simply a word that means a decision. It's a commitment to a course of action. Politics refers to the bargaining, negotiation, and compromise in pursuit of a desired end. Really, over the last 20 years, certainly in the English-speaking parts of the world, the phrase, the politicization of science has become more prominent, and it's usually used with a negative connotation. And if I put all these definitions together, it's simply the use of the systematic pursuit of knowledge as a means of bargaining, negotiating, and compromising in pursuit of a desired end. And one thing I want to open with here is that we want science to be politicized. We want science to be integrated in our political deliberations. The distinction that I'll make is between helpful politicization that contributes to more informed and better decision-making, and what we might call pathological politicization, which does the exact opposite. And we saw both kinds in the pandemic. And so the beginning of wisdom is to be able to know the difference between the good politicization and the bad politicization, and to design our institutions so they reinforce the good and limit to the extent possible the bad. This is the book that was mentioned in the introduction. I'm not going to go into any detail. There's a simple framework which really is supposed to give us a vocabulary for having a discussion of the different modes of interaction between experts and decision makers. One thing, and I'll highlight this as I get into the case studies, one thing that was clear is that many science advisors were unclear as to what role they were expected to play, and many policymakers were unclear also. And science advice did not operate under a set of shared expectations. In the book, there is a framework for how we know what role might be appropriate in what context. I won't go into that. All right, so one expert advisor that I had a chance to talk to, country will be unnamed, but said that they were put into a room after the pandemic started and sat around a table with other experts, and they had the feeling that there was an expectation that magic would happen. That if you put a bunch of experts in a room, then only good can come of it. And I guess the response to that is no, obviously, that's not how it works. We need to be much more systematic in how we think about expertise in decision making. All right, so let's drill down a little deeper. So what is advice anyway? So advice is guidance regarding a decision or a course of conduct. It's important to understand that advice is never free of a decision-making context. So there's different types of advice. There's science advice, which is a narrow sort of advice that drawing on specific experts. There's expert advice, which is a much broader concept of bringing together people with skill or knowledge to inform decision-making. And of course, there's political advice. Decisions are taken in contexts where there are citizens, there are consequences, there are costs and benefits. All of these I would lump under policy advice, so guidance regarding a decision. And one thing I think we need to get used to in our communities of experts is that science advice is policy advice. There's no way around it, and there's no way to insulate or wall off science advice from policy advice. So we might as well do it consciously. So some examples, I'll give you some examples of these different types of advisory mechanisms, and usually they are authoritative committees. There's the WHO Scientific Advisory Group for the Origins of Novel Pathogens, so the SAGO committee. They're a science arbiter, to use the honest broker framework. Their job is to make decisions about what sort of science would be needed to better understand COVID or expert advice. So the UN 1540 committee, it's also science arbiter, but it has a much broader body of expertise that it draws upon when it evaluates the implementation of the UN nuclear non-proliferation agreements. Political advice. So the UK Independent SAGE, this is not a government body, and I'll talk more about them as I go through. They use the honest broker framework to define their role as an issue advocate. They sought to get the UK government to implement specific policies that they thought would be best. So policy advice. So the European Union Reference Laboratory for Alternatives to Animal Testing. Their job was to develop a wide range of options to be alternatives to animal testing. So they're an honest broker. And I think everyone's familiar with the various national vaccine advisory committees, whose job is to render a judgment yes or no on approving vaccines that are brought before them. So expert advice comes in different forms and in different contexts. And again, this is why we have to be very specific and clear as to what we're talking about when we talk about expert advice. There's policy advice that's provided to parliaments, ministries, to leaders. Data is expert advice. So in the pandemic, it was, we're all familiar with the COVID dashboards. How many cases, how many people have been vaccinated, and so on. There's regulatory advice. As I mentioned, the vaccine approval is an example. And even public communications, recommending behaviors, stand 2 meters apart or 6 feet apart, masking, yes or no, and policy justifications. And each of these contexts implicates a different set of roles and responsibilities for the expert. All right, that's all the throat clearing part. Now let's jump into the ESCAPE project. This is some images from our Hong Kong case study led by Professor Kira Mattis. And you're not supposed to understand this. In Hong Kong, it is a very complex set of committees, organizations, agencies that make up the ecosystem of expert advice. Here's 3 more. On the left is Italy, in the middle is the Netherlands, and on the right is Japan. These are organizational charts. That the main point I want to make is that there's no recipe or formula for how expert advice should be constituted. There are many different approaches around the world, and the idea that we can implement, one approach and then move it from one country to another, it won't work that way. Things are deeply complicated. Expert advice did not get a lot of attention in the retrospectives that have so far been produced regarding the pandemic. So this is the WHO independent panel. They didn't say much. They said where science advice was sidelined and national approaches were characterized by denial, delay, and distrust, the result was uncoordinated and confused national efforts that were ineffective in curbing community transmission. That's a fine statement, but it doesn't nearly go far enough to understand the complexities and the realities of providing science advice to decision makers. So let me start with 5 key findings from the ESCAPE project. So number 1, with a few exceptions, national and international science advisory mechanisms were unprepared for a pandemic. Number 2, science advisory mechanisms lack clarity on their purpose and roles in providing expert advice to policymakers. Third, the integration of knowledge necessary to provide effective guidance on policy alternatives was rarely done by expert advisors. This is an important one. Number 4, shadow science advisory mechanism, and I'll explain that in more detail as I go through the talk, often played a pathological role in pandemic response. Not always, but often. Finding 5, emerging evaluations of pandemic response have thus far largely ignored mechanisms of expert advice. Now, I would note, as the WHO is debating and preparing some sort of pandemic treaty, which I think is a very good idea, notable by its absence, at least in the drafts that have been released and leaked, is high-level thinking about expert advice. And I think that's problematic because when the next pandemic occurs, and it will occur, we're going to need our experts to be better marshaled, better organized than in COVID-19. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump around a little bit and go through some key points from the case studies to help illustrate some of these findings. So one of the things that was clear across the case studies is that experience with pandemics or emergency situations laid the groundwork for better responses in the pandemic to marshaling scientific advice. So the example here on the left is the Japanese case, which after the H1N1 swine flu epidemic of more than a decade ago, but also in Japan, also the Fukushima nuclear crisis, brought together experts and policymakers and really forced Japan to think about how they were going to organize science advisory processes. And I would contrast that with the United States, which starting with the administration of George Bush almost 2 decades ago, started thinking and discussing response to pandemic, but really during COVID-19, it was a complete failure at the national level to bring together experts to inform decision-making. And let me say, that was a problem under Donald Trump. It's still a problem under President Biden. The United States does not have a very robust mechanism of science advice for a pandemic. So experience matters. This is another example from the United States. The United States didn't even have a data collection mechanism. And so, the United States, which is a colossus of science and technology, relied on a magazine, a wonderful magazine called The Atlantic, but it relied on a magazine nonetheless to volunteer to create pandemic data that was used by the United States. It's an incredible, incredible failure. And I focus on the US case because that's the case study I've been working on. If you take a look at the number of mentions of pandemic in the legislation of the US Congress, so that's this top panel, what you see is that after H1N1, there was a little bit of activity, but then it dropped off afterwards. And we see this in committee meetings and so on. We also see this in federal advisory committees in the US. A lot of attention after H1N1, and then things kind of disappeared. Less than 10 committee records mentioned pandemic in the year that COVID-19 emerged. One thing that was important in the US case, being such a big country, and we see this in many large countries, is that there are multi-levels of governance. So the US has its different states. In the UK, we see the different constituent nations. The level of response really varied according to governmental level. And this is something that I don't think we've given a lot of thought to in science advice is how do we reconcile advice that is given at different levels of government, national level, subnational level, city level, even universities or sports organizations. And what we saw in the pandemic is that decision makers would go advice shopping. So if you're in North Carolina, which is this red state here, you could say, well, I'd like to see what they're saying in Virginia or Tennessee, in neighboring jurisdictions. That said, Jessica Winkle, who led the North Carolina case, says that overall the state level response was very good, in part because they had experience dealing with climate change and sea level rise that forced the state government officials to engage with the scientific community. Again, here's the Japanese case. It's not just the wiring diagrams and the organizational structures. There were many informal processes in place where experts and policymakers had developed a degree of trust in each other that carried over to the pandemic. The UK response is also another very fascinating case study. Here's how the UK pandemic advice looked at the outset of the pandemic, and the official body is called SAGE, Science Advisory Group in Emergencies, and you see a very clean, simple structure, and then very quickly it evolved. And we see this pretty much in every country around the world, is that science advisory mechanisms were being built, revised, canceled, restarted as the pandemic emerged. And that's, to some degree, that's to be expected because the pandemic was a novel pandemic. But also, one hypothesis might be that, well, maybe we haven't thought this through as much as we should have. Now, in the UK, this is from the Parliamentary Report on Science Advice, the first one. One of the criticisms was that SAGE provided guidance narrowly focused on public health. Excuse me. And you can see here, it says SAGE was not constituted to give economics advice. The main fault line in many places around the world in the pandemic The political fault line was between trade-offs between the economy and public health. And what policymakers were forced to do was make decisions that dealt with those trade-offs. In many places, science advice was constituted to provide information on public health, and economics was left to the Treasury Ministry or someone else to take care of. So what we found in the UK is that, well, SAGE was not constituted to give economic advice, but its guidance says that it was supposed to have the full range of advice. So the question here is, well, who does the integration? Who takes knowledge, puts it together in the form of policy options for decision makers? That's us. That's us experts. That's our job. Similarly, just recently, this is Anthony Fauci in the United States. He gave an interview to the New York Times. He said, "I'm not an economist. It was for other people to make broader assessments." So this raises the question, were policymakers given incomplete or limited information that focused narrowly on one outcome? Public health is important, but so too is the economy. Still today in the United States and in the UK, there are no mechanisms for integrating public health considerations with economic considerations. We might say the same of education and closing schools and so on. That's a big problem. All right, in the Dutch case, this provides a good example of what we have called in the project shadow science advice. Shadow science advice borrows a term, it's a term used in Commonwealth nations to talk about a shadow government. That's the parties that are out of power put together. And the idea of a shadow government or shadow science advice is that you have a loyal opposition. You have a group that wants to see things succeed. As I'll show you, that's not always the case. In the Netherlands, there's this group called the Red Team, and that's a term of art that refers to a team that's supposed to challenge official bodies that participated, a self-organized group of experts that participated in trying to inform the governmental response. You don't need to see these in any detail. What I want to point out is that the Red Team in the Netherlands included a focus on the economy, whereas the official government bodies did not. Another interesting aspect of the Red Team in the Netherlands is that after they published several reports and they aired their views, they disbanded. They said, well, we don't believe we're adding value anymore. We may actually subtract from the legitimacy of the official bodies. So we've said our bit and we're standing down. Italy, Silvia Camporisi and colleagues have a fantastic case study. And in Italy, there were 3 high-level, national-level advisory bodies, one on public health, one on social science, and one on ethics. And from their study, Italy's Science Advisory Committee did not seem to be aware or had plainly forgotten that an economic and social council existed. Again, it's not the institutional structures that matter so much as what you do with them. And if the public health and the economic and social councils aren't talking to each other, then advice will be limited. Back to the Dutch case. They evaluated these different bodies. So the green, red, blue, and purple are just different advisory mechanisms. And they evaluated them using the honest broker framework as to what roles they played at different times in the pandemic. And all you need to see here in this figure is that each of these bodies assume different roles at different times. And that can be problematic because, for example, for those of you familiar with the honest broker framework, the honest broker seeks to expand consideration of alternatives. The issue advocate seeks to reduce them. You can't do both at the same time. So it's certainly natural that people might be confused if you're an expert on a committee, if you're a policymaker, and certainly if you're the public as to what role these bodies are actually playing. This is from a poll that was taken in middle of 2020, and it's an evaluation of how experts did in different countries based on the public's view. And really, I put this here because this to me doesn't say anything about expert advice. This says how satisfied were citizens at this particular time, very early in the pandemic, with their overall government response. United States is at the bottom, New Zealand is at the top. It's very hard, and this is something that we could discuss, but it's very, very hard to evaluate the fidelity of expert advice. One thing that was clear throughout the pandemic, and these are just some newspapers from the UK, is that expert advice is unavoidably political. And the response cannot simply be to say, well, let's build a bubble around our expert advisors and keep them away from politics and keep politics away from them. We will be much better served by figuring out how to institutionalize process that integrate expertise with politics to develop better policy. All right, let me say something about shadow science advice. Shadow science advice is defined as when experts self-organize to provide guidance to government or to challenge government for whatever reason. Now in the middle here, you see the independent sage. From my perspective, this was a particularly cynical approach to shadow science advice. Remember, the official body in the UK was called SAGE, Science Advisory Group for Emergencies, and the group of outsiders wanting to challenge the government appropriated that name and put independent in front of it. And you can see, I don't know if you can read the subtext there, but it says following the science. Even members of the UK Parliament became confused about whether independent SAGE was the government body or the SAGE was the government body. If someone asks you, would you prefer SAGE or would you prefer the independent SAGE? Many people say, well, I'd like the one that's independent. The independent SAGE did have some successes in convincing the official body to be more transparent, to share more information. But it was very much a political group pushing certain options that we might say helped to delegitimize pandemic response. There were dueling declarations, the Great Barrington Declaration and the John Snow Memorandum. I already talked a bit about the Dutch Red Team. Sweden had a particularly nasty dispute among scientists over the country's pandemic response, and this was their independent science forum that was created. In the United States, a gentleman named Scott Atlas appeared on Donald Trump's favorite television news channel and went from being a shadow science advisor to being brought to the White House to actually lead the government science effort. One thing that I would recommend is that our scientific communities, broadly constituted, need to have more open discussions about when, how it is appropriate for us to self-organize when we work within official processes. It is very easy to delegitimize expertise and governments. One paradox that emerges from our case studies is that we want to have discussion, we want to have debate as we're learning new information, that the transparency and openness of admitting uncertainties helps to reinforce and build public trust in science. At the same time, we in the expert community don't want misinformation. We don't want bad actors to participate in the process. And so figuring out how do we secure legitimacy and trust and empower dissenting voices in our science advisory processes. We're not very good at that. We're not good at that in an area like climate change, which is very mature and well developed. We're certainly not good at that in something like the pandemic. This conclusion may be unique to only a small set of countries, including the United States. But what do we experts do when our governments don't want policy to work or they're against experts? On the left here, this is a cartoon. This is Anthony Fauci. This is a cartoon that was put out by the White House calling him Dr. Faucet. And that's a joke that means he leaks to the press. And here's Anthony Fauci trying to stifle his laughter or disgust with Donald Trump saying something from the podium. What do we do as experts when governments are compromised or don't work properly? Again, something to discuss. Stealth advocacy. Stealth advocacy refers to when experts say something like, oh, all we're doing is following the science. That tells us what policies we should take. Obviously, science does not dictate or even tell us what policies to take. Stealth advocacy was very common across the case studies where scientists asserted their authority to try to tell the public what to do. Probably the opposite of that is misplaced accountability. So this is from the Italian case study where scientists wrote a report with some recommendations. Those recommendations were copy and pasted into official government policy. The idea there is that policymakers, politicians, elected officials, whose job it is to make decisions for the public, could then say, well, it's not our responsibility. We just did what the scientists told us to do. And this is where understanding the difference between honest brokering, where you give decision makers options, and advocacy, where you tell them what to do, can get in the way of democratic accountability. This is in the United States, but I think we've seen this in many places around the world. The trust in the Centers for Disease Control and Dr. Anthony Fauci declined across the board. This is in early to mid 2020. And the red arrows show how much trust declined in just a very short 5-month period across US political parties, Democrats and Republicans. It's very easy to delegitimize expert bodies. And so we experts need to talk with each other so that we constitute and build processes that can be seen and truly be legitimate and authoritative in such situations, because we need expertise. All right, some closing observations. So science advisory mechanisms in many nations were unprepared or ill-equipped. Even so, some countries and regions were able to overcome this and successfully, the quote is, build the plane while you're flying it. Substantively, science advice has typically been divided narrowly, but policymaking would benefit from more integrated policy advice. That means putting together things like public health and economics in the form of policy options for decision makers. I do wonder if it's time to retire the phrase science advice. Apologies to INCSA and Remy, but to focus on expert advice. Expert advice is a much broader concept. And in the pandemic, it became clear that many people thought science advice was advice provided to policymakers by men and women in white lab coats, rather than the broad sort of expertise that we need in order to develop policy alternatives. Shadow science advice can be helpful or pathological. And my advice, what I tell my colleagues, is that if you don't know the difference between what it means to be helpful and what it means to be pathological, then you should slow down in your efforts to provide shadow science advice. And then finally, policymakers would benefit from greater understandings of expertise. Undoubtedly, we need policymakers to better understand science, but it's just as important for experts to better understand both policymaking and norms of democratic governance. We need to do a better job of training our experts to understand what they're getting into when they work on advisory processes. Some thank yous to the different participants of the case studies that I cited here. There are an equal number of case studies that I did not talk about. And of course, I'm the only one responsible for crazy things said today. Here's how you can find me. Pielke@colorado.edu is the easiest. And I discuss these things out in public, try to practice what I preach at the Honest Broker newsletter. And with that, I look forward to chatting with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pielke. Now it's time for discussion. I'm sure he will entertain some questions from you. Yes, please. Can you, the mic is there.
Hello, Roger. Can you hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Just a question on shadow advice. You said that it could be helpful and pathological. Given, assuming that people who provide science advice under the name of shadow advice, let's say like a shadow government of we see in Commonwealth countries, in what way it could be pathological? Can you elaborate? I mean, if we have a body like this, it could be a check on governmental science advice. So in that sense, it could be useful. But in what way it could be pathological? Can you elaborate?
Yeah, certainly. And it's a great question. So one thing that could occur is if let's pick any national setting, you have a government science advice that says vaccines are safe and vaccines are important for protecting the community. And you have a group of scientists who organize outside of government and say, well, we think vaccines cause autism and other bad sort of outcomes. You should not take vaccines. Then the public is faced with a situation where they see dueling experts, and there's really no way to reconcile these competing views. And so what happens is that science becomes reduced to mere politics. So people will say, well, does that align with my elected official or my political party? A better approach than that would be to bring in different dissenting voices into the formal government advisory process and have the discussion. And if there are areas of disagreement, that's fine, air those. If there is a consensus view, air that sort of consensus. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's not a perfect institution, but it's an essential institution. And it's a good example of the scientific community coming together to develop a consensus that not all is known and not all answers are completely certain, but by and large, it's an organization that's trusted, and it is one that has been around for 30 years. So my thinking is that when there are dissenting voices out there, it is very easy to delegitimize the entire architecture of science if we don't build processes that are inclusive. I guess the last thing I'll say is it's very clear in a number of country settings that shadow science advice was provided not to counter science or to come up with alternative interpretations of data or facts, but really to challenge government and to use science as a basis of authority for challenging government. So it was really the political appropriation of science to make political points. So how we deal with a wide range of views in different organizations, when at the same time we're trying to organize experts within the umbrella of government, I think is a very important question.
Professor Roger, now we have many countries and each country has its own way of dealing with these issues. But in some countries, government not very receptive to scientific advisors. And can you share some experiences how such situations have been dealt with to bring government around to listen to this expert advice?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And this is one I often say to my colleagues that experts need to make peace with democracy. And the best that we can hope for, is that policymakers will see advice as legitimate and will listen to it. There's no guarantee that the decisions will follow that advice, that other factors won't be considered to be more important in that advice. And so there's a challenge in securing effective and strong governance. And there's also a challenge in securing robust and reliable, trustworthy expert advice. And those are not the same thing. And there's very little that we experts can do to actually improve governance in whatever setting we happen to be in. If I'm in the city of Boulder or the United States or Sri Lanka or France or wherever, we are not in charge of politics. And the best that I think we can do is to make sure that the institutions that we have control of, national science academies, professional societies, the journals that publish our work, the expert advisory committees that we sit on, that they are as robust and operate with as much integrity as possible. And solving the problems of governance and in different settings is something that's probably well beyond the ability of the scientific community to address. It's frustrating. I get frustrated by it too. But and in the case of the pandemic, you know, it's very important to separate out pandemic response from the integrity of scientific advice to inform that response. We have a lot of control over the integrity of science advice to inform the response. We have very little control over the response itself. So it's possible to give good advice and see bad decisions be made. It's possible to give very bad advice and still good decisions are made. And it's the sort of thing that reconciling expertise with democracy requires understanding that advisors advise, decision makers decide. There is some blurriness in there, of course, in the real world, but there's very little we can do to make better governance occur.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think we have a little more time. Yes, yes, please.
Can I ask one question here? How do we build trust between policymakers, politicians, and experts? Because by challenging the government, sometimes they will block whatever advice that we are giving. We need to build trust because we are based on evidence and we are trying to give solutions. So do you have any experience or use case on building trust among all the players?
Yeah, it's interesting. So just 2 weeks ago, I offered testimony in front of the U.S. Senate. And the details don't matter, but what I took from it, what was most important, was that 2 U.S. Republican senators praised it and 2 Democratic senators praised it. And for me, the best way that we can build trust is to literally be honest brokers. I see in the scientific community, and it's not just in the United States, that academics, scientists have become much more open in expressing their political views. I see this in Nature magazine. I see this in Science magazine. I see this in the Lancet. The scientific community has itself become much more overtly political, certainly in the last 20 years. And it enables a view by the public and by politicians that we're just doing our work to push a particular political agenda. And I very much want to see, so honest brokering involves giving policymakers a set of options to achieve certain goals, and then say, all right, you decide what option you want to take. That has been criticized by some scientists who say, well, if we give them options, they might pick the wrong one, as determined by the experts. So we're just going to tell them the one we want. But I think we also have to recognize that we experts are a very select elite group. We are not representative of the societies in which we live. And so what we prefer is not the same sort of thing that might come out of a legitimate democratic or any other sort of governance process. In building trust, it's the sort of thing where we have to understand empirically what historically has worked in building trust and legitimacy and maintaining authority. And I think there's good knowledge of that in our community, and then practicing what we preach, putting that into place when we design our expert advisory committees. I don't think it necessarily has to be that difficult for us. I do think that stepping back from politics is the biggest challenge for the expert community.
Thank you. The next please. I think Ajit wanted.
Professor Roger, do you think that there's a certain amount of scientific literacy threshold required within the government for really the science advice to work? Because you showed this Anthony Fauci picture of covering his face. Thanks to technology, we heard almost in live that when President Trump kind of said, drink the disinfectants liquid to kill the bug. And then subsequently, the data also revealed that the public has actually, there has been a little bit of an buying for this because listening to the president by the public. Please.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one where, and this gets to the notion of adversarial governance. Science advisory mechanisms are important, not just because of the science and the evidence they bring, but they provide a formal, legitimate touchstone or point of departure that clarifies decision-making. So the example that you raise, you have Anthony Fauci and Donald Trump together standing at a podium talking to people. That's not how expert advice works. The expert advisors need to have some degree of independence to create their assessment work, to develop policy options, to render their judgments on facts. They need to be able to present them to policymakers and then step aside, and the policymaker stands at that podium. And if the policymaker says, yeah, my experts said that we should have vaccines, but I think you should drink bleach, then the citizens can see that. And again, this gets to some of the failures of governance. I'm a big supporter of the importance of institutions of science advice. And we need to have robust institutions. The examples that I have used recently to try to describe this are institutions of diplomacy. We have experts in diplomacy who help policymakers make decisions in different nations' interests. Similarly, we have institutions of economic governance. So central banks, national data on statistics, and so on. We do a very good job in these other contexts. And maybe it's because science advice is still an immature and young area of governance. We need to treat science advice with the same seriousness that we treat diplomacy and economics, and build institutions of science advice that are just as robust. There are ministries dedicated to diplomacy. There are ministries dedicated to economics. We don't have anything remotely similar anywhere for science advice. And I would like to see science advice at the same level of stature as central banking and international diplomacy. And that's the way that we control what we can, which is providing expert advice, and make clear that decision makers are the ones that are either taking or not taking that advice in front of everyone to see.
Thank you. Next question, yeah.
I liked the point that you made that scientists and experts are probably part of an elite group of people and not necessarily representing the communities that they live in. And maybe even in COVID-19, decisions for lockdown, for example, affected far more the general populace compared to the experts and the scientists themselves. So in that context, because this is something that is within our power as scientific institutions, how do you think scientific institutions can become more attuned to sort of the general population, and should we have representatives from those groups in our scientific bodies and things like that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point. It's a great point. So if we're asked the simple question, how many people have COVID in our country. That's something that we don't need to have input from a broad spectrum of the public. This is something that experts can develop an answer to. But if the question is, should we lock down the economy? Should we keep children out of schools? This is one reason why I recommend expanding our vocabulary from science to expertise, because a parent who sends a kid to school has expertise. A farmer has expertise. And across the expert community, we have very good mechanisms for eliciting the views and values of the broader public. And we can do this through a number of different ways, but the key point is that it is essential to bring those views into the process of developing policy options. There's two reasons for that. One is they're going to be more robust and they probably will work better, but also they'll be viewed to be more legitimate than just a bunch of PhDs or wealthy scientists who work in their ivory towers telling everyone else what to do. And so it is, I think, a departure from how we have traditionally thought of expert advice, where we truly put the experts in a room and say, all right, tell us what to do, to saying, well, you experts go in that room, but make sure the door is open and you bring in members of the public, interest groups, actors in the economy, and make sure that any policy you come up with has been at least to some degree field tested with real people out in the real world.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? We have a few minutes more. Yes, please.
So Raja, a friend asked about the science literacy of politicians. But here now, look at certain countries, the general population, now even Sri Lanka, literacy rate is about 94 people who can read and write. But if you talk in terms of science literacy, that is very low. So even the advice is sound and correct. We have also people fishing in troubled waters and social digital media nowadays. So the general public could be provoked and could be even mobilized against even implementation of sound decisions. So this is a real challenge in some countries. The scientists and the experts proffer correct advice, but if the governments try to do that, then there will be mass protest rallies and so on. So could you share some of this experience, how such situation should be dealt with?
Yeah, and this is another great, and it's a very difficult question. But one thing we have to do, I think, as experts is to pay attention to the scientific research and understandings on what develops trust. And it's certainly true that we're not going to turn every citizen into an expert in anything. And so the relationship between experts and citizens is always going to be one of trust. So there is some research. So this is before COVID on childhood vaccination. There was a project in Western Australia that was done that instead of trying to convince citizens that vaccines were safe and effective, they had television commercials where people in the community would go on TV and say, here is why I vaccinated my child. So it was a community member speaking to other community members. And that led to an increased uptake or reduced vaccine hesitancy amongst the citizens there. In the United States, during COVID, the Black community in the United States is very skeptical in general of the public health establishment. There's very good historical reasons for that. A very famous basketball player in the United States, a man named LeBron James, went on TV after a basketball game, a Black man, and said, here's why I got vaccinated. And it turns out that that had a much greater effect on the uptake of vaccines among African Americans than do appeals to science or knowledge. So I think we in the scientific community need to become much more sophisticated in our understanding of social processes, how they work, how trust is developed. Expertise and science is a necessary but not sufficient condition for building trust. If you take a look at the actors who try to sow doubt or misinformation or distrust, they are very effective at using these sorts of strategies and techniques. And if all we answer with is, well, we're smarter than you and we have the peer-reviewed papers, expert knowledge will fail to be trusted. So we have to, again, it requires bringing in expertise in science and technology studies, science policy, social science, public communication, bring those folks into the room with public health experts, economists, and others. It's the integration of knowledge that is so important that we often don't do because we separate out into our disciplinary silos.
Thank you, Roger. Maybe one last question if you have. Okay, if not, we'll let you go. Thanks so very much for that very interesting talk and the lively discussion that followed. It has enriched our event very much, the workshop. Thank you very much, and we'll be in touch with you for further inputs. Thank you, Roger.
Yeah,
Thank you
and thanks for having my wife and I were in Colombo last March, and we had a wonderful visit, and I hope forward to another chance to see you. So good luck with your conference, and I'll say goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.